Now, joining me is human rights attorney Steven Donziger, who obviously has fought a Herculean fight himself over the last, well over a decade at this point, beating Chevron for historic settlement. You and your team beat Chevron and helped get $9.5 billion awarded for the indigenous people of Ecuador who had their water and land poisoned by Chevron. And for that, you were basically under arrest, both house arrest and then federal prison for how many days?
993.
Exactly. And thankfully, since April of 2022, you've finally been free to be able to do the good work you've been doing. And Steven, I wanted to start. You've been one of the leading voices, way more than any politician in America, on how important it is what's going on in Georgia right now, the Cop City movement, where obviously there's a lot of focus on Tyree Nichols, but people should also know the name of Manuel Terán, who is, everything I could tell, the first environmental protester that's been killed at a protest in America. Your thoughts on the latest with Cop City, which for those that haven't been following, has escalated. It is a environmental civil rights protest in Georgia to stop a $90 million police training center. I would call it a compound from being built in a protected public forest.
Well, thank you. Let me just start by saluting you and your team, Jordan. I think you guys do excellent work across the board on so many issues that the big media companies will not cover. I am, just so your listeners know, I'm a big supporter of Status Coup, and I hope everyone supports Status Coup and gives what it can today and tomorrow. I think that your independent voice and really that of other independent media are just vital, more vital than ever. So thank you for what you do, man. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. As regards Atlanta, I think people need to understand what's going on down there right now. The police in the United States, the Georgia police agencies that went into that forest to quote unquote clear it of protesters, have shot and killed the first climate activist in the history of our country. What does this mean? Well, first of all, understand that around the world, about 250 environmental activists, climate activists get murdered, assassinated every year. Most times in countries in the global south, but this is a growing phenomenon as the climate movement grows stronger and more successful. Of course, you wouldn't expect to see this kind of thing in the United States, but we have now seen it in the United States. We have crossed the Rubicon, and we as a country have joined the ranks of dozens of other countries around the world that regularly subject their environmental activists to huge risks, including death, the risk of police and state repression. And it's happening here. It happened to Manuel Terán in Atlanta, and there are several other activists in Atlanta, peaceful protesters, I might add, trying to protect the forest, who have been charged with domestic terrorism for engaging in the time-worn American tradition of civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience. So it's a real issue. I am extremely disappointed in the whole kind of liberal Atlanta establishment. The elected officials down there are not speaking out about this. This police academy is I think, should not be built. Certainly, if it is built, should not be built on this precious, beloved green space in Atlanta. Senators Warnock and Ossoff from Georgia have not said a thing about it, have not criticized the killing of the climate activists, have not even asked questions.
I want to show your tweet real quick, because you tweeted about their silence earlier this week, saying unsettling that Georgia Senators Warnock and Ossoff remain silent on the first ever U.S. police killing of a climate activist. The Georgia police narrative about the killing of Tort is highly suspect. Show some courage, ask the tough questions, demand answers. We should say We should say Tita Desiree Berg, who's a reporter for us, she interviewed one of the protesters that have been arrested down there and charged with domestic terrorism. And that protester said, as far as they know, none of the protesters had weapons in that forest. And go ahead.
I think that's an important point. I mean, the police narrative to me doesn't add up. Of course, we don't know all the facts. What we do know is that the agency doing the investigation is not an independent agency. It's part of the police task force that was charged with clearing the forest. It's called the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I get the feeling watching them operate, they don't know what they're doing. That we don't know who is leading the investigation. They're missing body cam footage. There's pictures of these SWAT team members invading the forest with body cam footage, and now they claim there is none of what happened. Manuel was known by his colleagues as a peaceful person, not someone who would engage in any form of violence. The whole point of the occupation of the forest to prevent the construction of Cop City was to engage in peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience. So this doesn't add up. There needs to be an independent investigation, in addition to an independent prosecutor appointed from out of state, someone with no ties to the state, because almost every elected leader in the state, starting with the governor on down, has already defamed the peaceful protesters as terrorists or criminals. So, we need to understand the facts. And by the way, there needs to be an independent autopsy that will tell us a lot whether the young person was killed at close range. Was the person laying down? There's a feeling among many activists that Manuel was assassinated in cold blood, and I just find it really curious that there's no body cam footage, not only of the incident, but what happened before and after, when there were literally dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of heavily armed soldiers. I mean, they call them police. They actually look like army soldiers in that forest at the time. So we need to understand the facts, and people need to be skeptical of the police narrative, and they need to also understand that the agency doing the investigation is not independent. I find it appalling, frankly, that the mayor of Atlanta and the senator, Stacey Abrams, even have not said a word. I mean, at least call for an independent investigation. We have two members of Congress, Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib, who have done so. Not to mention, most outside observers. This is getting attention literally all over the globe. It's appalling what happened. Didn't need to happen. And frankly, even if Manuel, supposedly shot a police officer, which again doesn't make any sense, but if indeed that is what happened, it still doesn't excuse this death, because this was orchestrated, in my opinion, by the police, by the way they attacked the forest. I mean, if you want to clear protesters that were really sleeping in hammocks and living in tree houses, living in tents, you don't mount a warlike invading force with heavy armored vehicles that look like tanks and heavily armored soldiers. I mean, that's a recipe to kill. The people entering the forest, frankly, from the photos, look bloodthirsty. The governor, Kemp, had already described the people in the forest as terrorists, which is preposterous. It's preposterous. These are people engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. So, the Georgia authorities have a lot to answer for. And frankly, the Georgia political leaders, including the Democrats, in my opinion, have a lot to answer for.
And I wanted to ask you about that, because to me, there's a lot of discussion about censorship on the internet and things like that, but I don't hear as much about the escalation of basically trying to criminalize American protest. I mean, I saw it beginning in Standing Rock, where they were trying to charge indigenous people who were banging on drums and dancing and singing with felonies. And it's only gotten worse to the point now. I mean, Status Coup went through the arrest warrants. They're charging between 15 and 20 protesters with domestic terrorism for things like fleeing the police. We just saw from Tyree Nichols There's a lot of good reason to flee police sometimes. They're being charged with domestic terrorism for the act of protesting in a tree, for having flares on them. I mean, preposterous things, but it has a chilling effect because a lot of people who want to protest might hesitate if they think they're going to spend 20 to 30 years in jail.
Well, let's call it for what it is. It's state repression. This isn't terrorism. The terrorism charges are being manufactured to generate emotion. So people, go along with what's essentially an effort to weaken and ultimately silence the climate movement. I mean, the people in the forest were successful. They had blocked and continue to block the construction of Cop City, which is, again, a misguided police training complex. We've seen this, frankly, not just in the United States, these overhyped terrorism charges as applied to climate activists. We're seeing it in Australia and Canada to a degree. I watch this issue very, very closely because, look, it's my opinion that as the climate movement grows stronger, as the fossil fuel industry feels more and more risk from this movement, as the industry, starts to directly fund police forces, public police forces to attack protesters, which is happening now in the United States, you're going to see more and more of this repression that ended up killing, Manuel Terán and ended up in, at least as far as I know, 13 people in Atlanta charged with domestic terrorism when they're not terrorists. I mean, at worst, they're trespassers. So this is wrong. I think it's illegal. I don't, by the way, as long as judges down there do their job, I don't think it's going to ultimately hold up in court. But that's not the point. The point of the exercise is to hype it up, attack these people, and use it as a weapon to intimidate others who might think about protesting. And no matter how the cases turn out, and I believe these charges should be dropped, or if they're not, they will be dismissed ultimately, as long as courts treat these people in a fair manner. The fact is they're getting months and months of free intimidation publicity to try to discourage others from joining this movement. And we need to understand that, and that's what's happening. Hey, Jordan, one other thing I want to add, and I just tweeted this. There's a connection between, the Memphis killing of Tyree and the police killing in Atlanta. What is that connection? The Cop City situation where people are trying to protect a beloved forest and prevent this unnecessary police academy from being built really brings together both the climate justice and the criminal justice movements in a really vivid way, maybe even for the first time in such a vivid way. And, police are really constructed in the United States out of the old slave patrols. I mean, they exist to protect power and to try to intimidate and terrorize people who successfully challenge power. And that's what Manuel Terán and his colleagues were and are doing in Atlanta. I don't know what happened with this so-called traffic stop in Memphis with Tyree, but what we witnessed in that sickening video is, police officers kind of acting like the old slave patrols. I mean, it was crazy, the brutality, to basically beat a man to death, filming it, thinking they're not doing anything wrong. I mean, the level of impunity. So these things are connected, and they're really connected by the common thread of police culture in the United States, which is, a culture of abuse. By the way, I know there's a lot of decent officers who try to do their jobs correctly. I think most officers are that way, but there are so many who act like this. We see this over and over and over again. We have far more police killings in this country than any industrialized country in the world. We kill 33, I looked this up today, by the way, 33 U.S. citizens out of every 100,000 are killed by police. Not 100,000, sorry, every million are killed by police every year in this country. In New Zealand, the rate is 2.8. We kill people, police kill people in this country at 15 times the rate in New Zealand, So I really think it's a structural issue, and I think these so-called reform efforts, while they need to be pushed and implemented, are not. They just don't get at the structural issue because it just keeps happening over and over and over again.
Absolutely. And my last question to you, obviously your fight against Chevron is not over since you finally have been freed out of prison, but you tweeted earlier in the week after decimating indigenous groups in the Amazon and evading a $9.5 billion pollution judgment in Ecuador, Chevron is now reporting a $75 billion buyback of its own stock. How the rich get richer while the poor die. This company should lose its license to operate. This is a company that refused to pay $9.5 billion, spent millions to criminalize you, to bankrupt you, and now has bought back $75 billion of its own stock. I mean, it's just, your thoughts.
It's appalling. It's the way our system in the United States seems to work. I mean, we can have capitalism and run it like, many countries in Europe are run, with a social safety net, with controls, with regulation, with, for example, there should be a windfall profits tax on Chevron and the other oil companies right now. They're making record profits off the war in Ukraine. But we just have the most extreme form of economic system here, massive, inequality of income and wealth. And the fact that Chevron is allowed to basically, literally kill thousands of Amazon indigenous peoples in Ecuador through their pollution, not pay a valid court judgment, and then spend billions buying back its own stock while the people down there continue to suffer and die. I mean, I just can't think of anything more unethical and appalling. And, look, for people who don't know, Chevron, I helped the indigenous peoples win this case. I'm a lawyer, worked many years on this. And in response, not only did Chevron not pay the judgment, they got a judge here in the U.S. to charge me with contempt of court for not turning over to the company my computer, my confidential attorney-client information. And they had me locked up, as I said, for almost 3 years. And by the way, I was prosecuted not by the U.S. government, which refused to prosecute me. I was prosecuted by a Chevron lawyer, private Chevron lawyer, appointed by the judge. That had never happened before in this country. We live in rough times, man. We just acknowledge it. Whether it's Manuel Terán, whether it's the young man in Memphis who was brutally murdered by police, whether it's Chevron prosecuting, a lawyer directly as they did to me, whether it's, Enbridge, spending millions to fund public police in Minnesota to arrest protesters at its pipeline. We are seeing the increasing corporatization of government. We're seeing police act almost as a public police act, as I think they are in Atlanta, as almost like a private security force for corporations. We live in very serious times. We need to connect the dots of all this stuff and understand that we are in a real serious battle to preserve what's left of our democracy and our freedoms and our rights. So people need to, and I know many people do, but look at the big picture, connect it all up, and organize around understanding that there are forces at play in our society that are very, very dangerous to the freedoms that we often take for granted.
Thank you, Steven Donziger. And people who want to support Steven, who still has plenty of legal bills, could go to freedonziger.com. That's freedonziger.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good luck.